All right, let's dive right into an absolutely astonishing true survival story. Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking a terrifying event that literally forever changed aviation. The unbelievable story of Air Transat Flight 236. We're going to look at how a multi-million-dollar state-of-the-art aircraft suddenly lost all power right over the open ocean, and what that actually tells us about our absolute reliance on computers.
So, picture this. It's like something out of a tense cinematic thriller. You're cruising at 39,000 feet, slicing through dark storm clouds over the Atlantic Ocean at night. Imagine the moonlight just reflecting off the metallic wings of an ultra-modern Airbus A330. It is pitch black out there, hundreds of kilometers from land. Inside that flight deck, the pilots are completely isolated, relying entirely on glowing banks of computers and sensors. In environments like that, well, you basically have to trust the machine implicitly, right?
Okay, let's set the scene. It's August 24th, 2001. Flight 236 leaves Toronto for Lisbon with 306 people on board. For the first 5 hours, everything is completely routine. You've got families heading to vacations, people sleeping, totally normal. But there was this one minor detail early on. Air traffic control directed them to adjust their route just about 60 miles south to avoid some traffic. Keep that in the back of your mind, because that tiny, seemingly insignificant navigational tweak, that's going to become the literal lifeline for those 306 people.
Now, looking at the timeline of the crisis, it's wild how fast a confusing sensor reading cascaded into a complete catastrophe. 5 hours in, the pilots get this bizarre warning: low oil temperature and high oil pressure on the right engine. It's a total anomaly, not even in their troubleshooting manuals. 20 minutes later, a fuel imbalance warning pops up. Fast forward another 5 minutes and a fuel emergency is declared. By 6:13 a.m., the right engine just dies. In only 13 agonizing minutes after that, the left engine cuts out too. In under an hour, they went from a totally normal cruising altitude to a complete dual engine failure.
So, how does that even happen? Well, there was a massive, crucial disconnect between what the pilots believed and what was actually going on. Confronted with confusing oil readings, the pilots just assumed the sensors were acting up. A standard computer glitch. But the terrifying reality? A fractured pipe was pouring massive amounts of aviation fuel directly out of the engine into the night sky. And because it was pitch black outside, even when the pilots had the crew shine flashlights out the cabin windows, the leak was completely invisible. This leads us to what happens next, and it is absolutely crucial. Trusting their standard Airbus manual for a standard fuel imbalance, the pilots decided to open a crossfeed valve. The goal was simply to balance the fuel between the wings. Makes sense, right? But because they had no idea there was a massive leak on the right side, they inadvertently pumped 17 tons of perfectly good fuel from the left wing directly out of that severed pipe on the right wing. In less than 30 minutes, they literally bled their own aircraft dry. Which brings us to a chilling number: 0. 0 engines remaining operational. And without engines, the massive generators that power all the electrical systems just fail. The lights flicker, they die, the cabin depressurizes. They are literally suspended over the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, plummeting through the dark.
A passenger actually said something that perfectly captures the sheer terror of that exact moment. They said, "You can literally hear a pin drop." The exterior was no sound in that plane, in that cabin at all. Think about that. The ultra-modern computerized Airbus was suddenly nothing more than a 300-ton dead silent glider. The roar of the jet engines, gone. Literally all that was left was the sound of the wind rushing past the fuselage as this massive plane steadily dropped toward the freezing water.
Obviously, the cabin crew immediately snapped into emergency mode. Another passenger recalled them yelling instructions like, "Take off your shoes, don't inflate your life jacket until we hit the water." This was the real deal. As the cabin lost pressure, flight attendants were sprinting down the aisles, preparing 306 terrified people for a water ditching. And just to put that into perspective, an ocean ditching is an outcome that commercial aircraft, especially ones with low-mounted tails, very, very rarely survive without breaking apart. Okay, remember that 60-mile route adjustment I mentioned earlier? Well, that tiny adjustment put them just close enough to Lajes Military Air Base, a tiny runway on the Azores island of Terceira, about 130 kilometers away. Captain Robert Piché and First Officer Dirk DeJager frantically calculated their glide path. Without power, a massive A330 loses 1,000 feet of altitude for every 5 kilometers it travels forward.
Doing that terrifying mental math in a life-or-death scenario, they realized Lajes was their one and only desperate shot at survival. If they missed it, they're in the ocean. To make it work, the captain actually had to execute a series of drastic 45-degree swerving maneuvers, just trying to bleed off excess altitude and speed. But even with all that, they were coming in hot, hitting a blistering 200 knots. Remember, they have 0 engines for reverse thrust. They couldn't even use their wing flaps to slow down because they didn't have full hydraulic power. They were essentially hurling a giant metal tube at a runway, relying on nothing but gravity and their emergency brakes. And man, the landing was incredibly violent. They slammed onto the runway extremely hard. The captain is just fighting to keep the nose down while the emergency brakes clamp onto the wheels. 8 of the plane's 12 tires violently blew out in this massive shower of sparks and shredded rubber. But against literally all odds, the massive airliner ground to a halt. And get this, they stopped just short of a 400-foot cliff at the very end of the runway. Every single one of the 306 people survived the longest glide in passenger airline history. Moving right along to uncovering the fatal flaw, the investigation into the fuel starvation. With the passengers safely down the emergency slides, the immediate crisis was over, but the investigation was just kicking off. Experts descended on the aircraft to answer one glaring question: how in the world did a highly advanced passenger jet simply run out of gas mid-flight? So looking at the root cause, it turned out this wasn't some profound design flaw in the aircraft itself. It was actually a shocking sequence of maintenance errors. 5 days prior, the right engine was replaced with a Rolls-Royce unit, but it was delivered missing a tiny hydraulic pump bracket. To avoid costly delays, mechanics substituted older, mismatched parts to save time. This meant a hydraulic tube and a fuel pipe were left sitting just millimeters apart. For 5 whole days, normal engine vibrations caused those pipes to rub together, slowly wearing down the metal, until mid-flight, a fracture finally happened. Air Transat publicly accepted responsibility for this insane cascade of errors. Basically, a missing millimeter-sized clearance bracket directly led to the near loss of over 300 lives. This resulted in a $250,000 fine for the airline, which at the time was the largest aviation fine in Canadian history. It's just a stark reminder, right? In complex machinery, cutting corners on a tiny, mundane part just to save time can have absolutely massive consequences. Now, looking at the human-machine interface and evaluating the flight deck response. The investigation definitely didn't stop at the maintenance hangar. They immediately pivoted back to the cockpit. Because yes, a pipe broke, but they had to scrutinize the pilot's fatal decision to open that crossfeed valve, which unknowingly pumped all their remaining fuel right out of the plane. And this right here brilliantly illustrates the inherent danger of modern automation. The pilots did exactly what the Airbus computer manual told them to do for a fuel imbalance: open the crossfeed valve. But look at the missing context. There was 0 checklist information provided to help them verify or handle a massive, unconfirmed fuel leak amidst all that conflicting sensor data. They were totally uncharted territory, trusting a computer checklist that was fundamentally flawed for the actual reality of their situation. To make absolutely sure this never happens again, the aviation industry implemented sweeping changes after Flight 236. Airbus completely modified its fuel imbalance checklists. Today, onboard computers don't just sit there passively waiting for pilots to figure things out. They actively compare actual fuel consumption to the flight plan. If there's an abnormal drop rate, automatic warnings literally scream at the pilots. Plus, Rolls-Royce issued immediate alerts regarding incompatible parts. The whole system was totally overhauled, so the machine actively verifies reality rather than just blindly running standard checklists. All of this brings us to a deeply fascinating debate. Airbus formally blamed the crew for mishandling the leak, but the public and pilot associations hailed Captain Piché and First Officer DeJager as absolute heroes for safely landing a 300-ton glider. It really leaves us with a critical question to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. As our world becomes more and more reliant on complex, automated systems, when those computers inevitably fail or give us confusing data, who truly carries the ultimate burden of survival? The humans in the loop or the machines they're forced to trust? Something to think about the next time you board a flight.